Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Shelley Williams, president with the Indiana Chamber Executives Association. MIKI is a joint effort of Michigan, Illinois, Kentucky, and Indiana Chamber professionals, and we are offering the Mondays with MIKI monthly through the remainder of this year. Housekeeping is just post your questions in the chat box, and we will get to those as we move through the presentation today. We have people still logging in, but I am a time watcher. So with that, it's a pleasure to introduce Tom Difiore. Tom, you might have worked with, he's been in the industry since the 1990s, 1995. He is an expert and known nationwide for helping communities fund projects and fundraising efforts. And we'll share Tom's bio, full bio out with everyone and contact information. What intrigued our group to have a session talking about mergers came from a white paper that Tom's organization, the National Community Development Services, released last September on the pros and cons of chamber mergers with economic development and other organizations. So after reviewing the white paper, I reached out to Tom. He is a wealth of information if you're in this process for your community, and has just great information to bring to the table today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom for the program, and please post any questions in the chat box. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for those of you who have joined. If you have joined, I assume this topic may be of some interest to you. I want to reference the white paper. I'm not just going to replicate what's in that white paper, but there is some good information there, particularly in terms of real life examples. Shelley mentioned a link. There's a link on the page now, but if you just go to our website, I'm sure you can find it at some point. That white paper also prompted a very similar webinar that I did with Golden Shovel Agency, probably back in October, November, that parallels this, but I won't replicate that either for those of you who may have been on that. And one of the differences between then and today, that was obviously a lot more people, and it was a lot different organizations. Since most of you are assumingly chamber executives, I'm going to kind of tailor my remarks more towards the chamber of commerce side of things if I can. But I want to make it clear up front that I'm not an advocate for mergers. This is not a you must merge or die sort of presentation. It really is, just to make sure that everybody, I'm sure many of you, especially if you're on this meeting, you've either heard rumblings in your community that a merger may be in order, or you're just smart enough to read the tea leaves that it may be coming down the road at some point, particularly in light of the pandemic, finances, pressures on organizations, and all those things probably are going to prompt more and more discussions around, do we really need multiple organizations doing things? So if that's the case, hopefully you're going to get some good takeaways here. I do think, and I want to mention again, that you as chamber professionals are in the best possible place to lead and drive these discussions if they go on in your community. So I want everybody to be aware of that. And with that, I'm going to get started. I'm going to stop my video so you guys don't see me looking at my notes. And Shelley, please be sure, I'm assuming everybody can see my screen. If you can't, please chat to Shelley that you can't, and we'll try to fix that. But let's go ahead and get started. And my screen doesn't want to advance. Okay, here we go. So first thing I want to do is make sure that, I set expectations. This is not a one-size-fits-all. I by no means am an expert in this topic. Frankly, I don't think anybody really can be, because mergers by definition are very personal. They involve people and personalities. So every situation, every community is going to be different. So this is certainly by no means a checklist, do this and only this kind of presentation. And while the merger question of whether we're merging chambers and EDOs, or chambers and EDOs and workforce development and downtown groups and CBBs and all the other sort of folks that fall into the community and economic development realm, there is a fundraising component almost every time when there is a merger. So while it may not be driven by fundraising issues, everything I know about this has come from my experience in raising money. in some cases, we were in a community where the merger decision was made in advance and they brought us in to fund a newly merged organization. There's others where a merger, a joint venture structure sort of emerged from the assessment that we did. And we ended up recommending that in order to optimize these organizations' funding situation, that they should consider a merger or some sort of joint venture. We've told organizations that have brought us in and to raise money, we've flat out told them, look, you probably should not proceed with any sort of fundraising effort until or unless you at least consider a merger or some sort of collaborative effort with other organizations in your community. And there's even been instances where we recommended a split. In other words, and you in the chamber world know this, oftentimes you create organizations because of something going on in your community. It may be a leadership group, it may be a housing organization, it may be an incubator or something like that. And oftentimes after you've stood those initiatives up and they're still living under your roof, it may be time to spin them off and let them fly out and survive on their own. So we've made those recommendations too. So ultimately what I want to accomplish today is help you all understand the kind of things that drive these merger discussions, whether or not it may or may not be right in your community, and to certainly give you a certain knowledge base and a perspective so that you can navigate the process, so that you'll be looked at, as I said, sort of the leader and the driver, and that you get to make this happen for you and you don't let it get done to you, if you get my drift. And the last thing I want to mention before I move on is that as I go through these points, most of it will be from a community perspective, but there will be times where I emphasize this is the perspective from you as the executive of the organization. So I'm going to charge on here if I can. Okay, what drives these mergers? Lots of things, and my suspicion is most of you are seeing some or all of these. The first one is pretty typical. I know in the MIKI region, you've got several regional organizations. I know the Indian Chamber is the one that we actually mentioned in our white paper. One Southern Indiana, Greater Louisville Inc. are a couple that come to mind. I know the Kindle organization. These are all regional chamber and economic development groups. Some of them probably came about as mergers. Some of them probably just developed that way. But the point is that regionalism is often a very good reason to merge. It's certainly the most straightforward, usually the least controversial. In the simplest form, smaller communities come together and figure out, hey, if we join forces and we get together, we can fight above our weight class. And many of you have probably heard this discussion before. It's certainly true in the economic development world, where when you're trying to fight for global investment and you're trying to get your message out to the world, you can certainly do that better when you come together as a regional or multi-geography sort of organization. These can sometimes be difficult to navigate, and I'll mention that in my next slide when I talk about challenges and obstacles. But ultimately, it comes down to the biggest challenge being that regional pride. If any of you represent small town chambers, you have a strong history, you have a certain local pride, you may have a number of local events that everybody associates and affiliates with your organization, and you worry about losing some of that local tradition. I think you can do these without losing that, but in some cases it may be time for some of those sacred cows to go by the wayside. Probably the most important thing in this particular cause or factor in the merging question is that it needs to be driven by business people. The fly in the ointment in these discussions is typically local government, whether it be municipal, city, or county, because elected officials and municipal staff, they see lines and boundaries where business people don't. And they sometimes have a tough time seeing the benefits to them when we start merging with municipalities and regions that are across the county line or across the city limits. that if something happens there, it's not going to benefit my side of the city line or the county line. So you just got to get past that. The second typical, and if some of you are hearing rumblings in your community, it's probably related to this one. We hear a lot, and this is certainly going to come as no surprise to most of you, that there seems to be perceived duplication, overlap, turf battles. We've seen them all. They happen everywhere, small town, big town, it doesn't matter. The key thing I think for you as a chamber executive to understand is, number one, be sensitive if these perceptions are out there. You need to be aware of them. You need to get out ahead of them. And that you should do, one of two things or both. Number one, don't dismiss them offhand. You need to take a good inventory of other organizations in your community that are likely being perceived as overlapping and duplicating your services. We like to recommend that folks do a matrix where they list all the organizations down the, across the top side of a piece of paper, and all the various functions down the left side, down the vertical side, ranging from economic development to legislative advocacy, to entrepreneurship and leadership development and incubators and workforce and education and on and on and on. All the various functions that are part of community and economic development. Create a matrix and see how many organizations are claiming to do some of these things. Oftentimes, doing that matrix will help you either prove or show that the overlap and duplication isn't real and they shouldn't worry about it, or it will show that, we're getting in each other's lanes, and if that's happening, then you as the leader of this process should either do one of two things: suggest a merger and talk to some of these organizations about joining forces, or take the lead on trying to make sure everybody sort of stays in their proverbial lane, and that you get rid of this duplication and overlap discussion. Synergies, again, in light of the pandemic and pressures on finances, there's probably going to be a growing movement for some merger discussion to create some synergies between organizations. These are not necessarily bad reasons to do this. Merging to take advantage of synergies and economies of scale is pretty typical, and on the surface really shouldn't be controversial. Obviously, the check writers love it. If I'm one of your members and I've got 3 other memberships in town that I'm paying, I love the idea of paying fewer memberships. But just be sure that by merging for this particular reason, that you don't diminish the focus and expertise of a specific function that may be better executed without the merger. If there's something that's really important in your town, whether it's your own government affairs program or workforce or whatever it may be, just make sure that by merging, that really important function doesn't end up getting sort of undermined or underperforming as part of a larger group. Major funders, this is rare, but I have seen it happen, and the cautionary tale is don't let yourself get into the situation where 1 or 2 major funding organizations in the community can dictate this just because they are the major funders. And that is exactly what happens. I've seen it. Well, actually, and I guess your geography there, years ago, we were working in the Quad Cities. And we were working on the Iowa side, but I remember the discussions about merging some of the Quad Cities organizations because John Deere and Wells Fargo, who were the biggest dogs on both sides of the river, frankly, their leadership didn't understand why they were paying so many different Chamber of Commerce memberships and so many different economic development dues and things like that. And they sort of drove the process to create some consolidation there in the Quad Cities. The other example I know about that we didn't actually work, but I'm familiar with Birmingham, Alabama, and Regions Bank and Alabama Power were the biggest dogs in town. There was nobody close to them, and they were frustrated, or for whatever reason, with the chamber and what was then the Metropolitan Development Board. And just by sheer strength of size, they decided they were going to merge the two, and the outcome was the Birmingham Business Alliance. There's nothing, intrinsically wrong with that, but what happens is that when a couple of key people are driving the boat, you get a lot of other people that get kind of caught up in the wake, particularly staff and other volunteers who may not necessarily be all in, but they kind of got to go along to get along, and that obviously can create some problems. This one, I would say, is less typical and certainly the wrong reason to merge, in my opinion, but we have seen it. And ultimately, if you've got a chamber, an EDO, and maybe 2 or 3 other organizations, at some point in their life cycle, one or more of them is going to find itself in trouble. It's lost members, it's losing money, it's not as relevant as it used to be, and there are a million reasons why this happens, but it does. And we've seen cases where when that happens, that organization, from a standing of weakness, frankly, finds itself, sort of going hand in hand to the stronger organization across town or across the hall and saying, hey, we're struggling, can you let us in? Will you take us in and let's join forces? In my opinion, again, that's the wrong reason to do it, because taking a strong organization and bringing a weak organization inside of it, just for survival purposes, doesn't do anybody any good. It works much better if that weak organization sort of retrenches and figures out what's our problem, and maybe they just need to go away, and the few surviving in the few remaining relevant functions of that organization may get gobbled up by the other organization, and that's okay. But just merging to save one for the sake of saving it, in my opinion, doesn't make much sense. Leadership changes. This is pretty frequent. Some of you hopefully aren't in this boat, but typically what happens is the need or the value of merging or consolidating organizations has been there for some period of time, but the community leaders have resisted the urge to do that out of respect for a long-time chamber executive or economic development executive. He or she has been there for 20 years. We're not going to do it on their watch. So when they finally decide to hang it up and retire, then that prompts everybody to say, finally, we can do this. And that's fine. That's a good reason. But just know that if you're hearing that, or if you're seeing this in your community, there's probably a pretty good chance that some of your stakeholders have been thinking that it may be long overdue and it should have been done a long time ago. And then this is the last one, which I think is probably a agglomeration, if you will, of all of the above. But it really is the bottom line here is the best reason to do a merger or to consider a merger, or the best indication that you've got that your community has proliferated too many organizations that are all kind of stumbling over each other and doing some of the same thing and that overlap and things like that. And that is this idea that, I don't care whether you're from a small town or a huge metropolitan area, the amount of financial resources and good leadership are in short supply, or at least they're not in infinite supply. So what we see very frequently is that you have a lot of good causes over the years that have prompted someone or some group of people to create an organization. Maybe some, like I mentioned earlier, have spun out of the Chamber of Commerce, but at some point you get financial resources and leadership resources have become so diluted across all of those organizations that none of them can be really as effective as they would be otherwise. And typically, and I'm sure some of you have seen this, you've got your strong leaders in town, your bank, your power company, the hospital, the local headquarter company, and the big plan in town. They're writing 4, 5, 6, 8 checks to all these organizations. They can't say no to anybody. They have to be members of everyone. And what they end up doing is they provide token resources to all of you where it would be much better for the community if they would provide capacity resources to one or two or three organizations that would really move the needle. And it goes the same thing with leadership. You know, if you got all these organizations, well, they all got to have a board of directors. And I think we can all agree that there's only so many good leaders in your community. And so somebody's going to be stuck with what I would call marginal board members, or board members that really aren't that effective because all the good ones have already been taken. So if you see that happening in your community, it's probably time to think and maybe get out ahead of things and say, you know what, it might be time to combine some of our efforts. So what's going to get in the way? If let's presume you or your leaders or a handful of people have said, you know what, it's probably time to look at and consider merging one or more organizations. As you go through that process, and maybe it's already been decided that it's the right thing to do, and you've been put in charge of making it happen, well, you're going to find some obstacles. These obstacles will come in many forms. None of these that I'm about to enumerate probably surprise any of you. But the first one is staff resistance. At the end of the day, we're talking about people fighting for their jobs. If you're the chamber CEO and there's an economic development organization down the street and your respective leaders have decided it's time for you to merge, well, you know, one of you may be losing your job. Actually, both of you may be losing your job, because in a lot of instances when they do this, they start with a new executive. I get it. I understand it. It's natural. It's human nature. You know, if you're going to be protective of something, what better than your job and your livelihood? But just know that if you're in the position of strength, the other staff members at those other organizations, if they see themselves in a position of weakness, they're more than likely fighting against it, whether overtly or behind the scenes, and they may do all they can to either undermine the merger or to make you look bad in a competition for, you know, to who keeps their job. So be aware of that. Similarly, volunteer egos. I've seen chairmen of organization, board chairs who ultimately, you know, while all of their peers have said it's time, it's the right thing to do, we need to come together, there's always one that says, nope, not on my watch, because for whatever reason they see it as a sign that they failed, or, you know, whatever. It's wrong. It's probably not true, but it does happen. So just be aware that even if pretty much everybody decides that coming together and merging organizations is the right thing to do, you may encounter one or more volunteers who stand in the way of it. If that happens, you're going to have to use your leadership ability to figure out a way around that. And more likely it's through a peer or someone that they respect. Public sector issues. This is where I mentioned that regional and geographic coming together. You know, not so much anymore, but typically if you do have a separation of chamber and economic development organizations, you know, typically the chamber is the grassroots business community and primarily funded through local business and their membership dues. And the local EDO may be funded primarily, if not exclusively, through public monies, city, county, and otherwise. Well, when you start bringing those two together, you're opening up a huge can of worms. Not only do the public sector, as I mentioned, sometimes have trouble putting money into something that may benefit the county, the next county over, or the next city over the city limits, and they have to get past that. But they may have trouble if they perceive that their monies are being you know, commingled with Chamber of Commerce monies. And the other issue is, you all as chamber executives know that sometimes you may have a hard time taking public money because of your mission and your government affairs and your PACs and things like that. And you're like, well, how do I take public money and then next week go down to a city council meeting and fight something that they're doing? You know, how's that going to work? Well, that is an issue. I'm not here to tell you how to solve it. All I'm here to do is tell you to be aware of it and to find, you know, it can be solved, and sometimes it's through creative bookkeeping, which I'll get to in a minute. But generally, you've just got to find ways to keep those issues at bay so that you can continue doing your mission without this issue of public money coming into your coffers, clouding or impacting what you do. Logistics, this is pretty simple. Hey, we're merging with that other organization. Neither one of our offices are big enough to accommodate both of us. What are we going to do? Oh crap, we got to get new office space. What are we going to call ourselves? You know, what's our branding and marketing and logo and all these things. You know, it's the reality. It's a pain, but you got to deal with it. There are the biggest sort of conundrum that I've seen is when you merge a chamber and economic development organization. Frequently, those EDOs have real estate. You know, they own land at the industrial park. They own spec buildings. They have loan programs and things like that. So how do you bring them into your universe and deal with some of those things? Again, I'm not the expert. You're going to have lawyers and accountants and all those people involved. It can be done, but just be aware as you start the process, those are things you're going to have to think about. All this really summarizes it's hard. You know, one of the biggest obstacles you will have if you decide to do a merger is just the sheer, you know, pain in the you know what of doing it. It's not easy. It's just like merging companies. But if the community has decided that, you know, it's for the greater good, well, then you and others are going to have to kind of suck it up and go through this unpleasantness of all these hassles and things that frankly you didn't think you signed up for. This last one really reflects sort of the end state of things rather than the during the merger. But oftentimes when two organizations merge, the expectations, again, in the funding community is, oh, great, I'm only going to have to pay one set of dues and one membership now instead of two. And that one membership should be way less than the two that I was paying separately before. Well, that may not be the case. They may actually have to pay more and should pay more. So just know that when you merge, you're going to have some stakeholders in your community that think that the backside of that merger is going to mean that you're going to be able to do more with less. And that is not necessarily true. And it's certainly, as I mentioned, the wrong reason to merge. But again, be aware that people are going to have that expectation. So before I put this up, sort of following up on that last point, a lot of mergers are done because people think they're going to, you know, create synergies and save money. This quote on the screen right now, I have to credit to a CEO of an organization in Wisconsin, actually, that had merged. It had two separate chamber and EDOs that had been separate forever. They came together because of that leadership change that I mentioned. In other words, they had two 25-year tenured executives that both retired about the same time. And the community leader said, finally, we can get these two organizations together like they should be. They went out, did a search, hired an outside CEO. She came in from another state and everything was good. But what she realized very quickly once she got there was that many people's expectations were, as I just mentioned, that they were going to do more with less. And when she was out trying to raise money and you know, renew memberships and things like that, she heard people saying, hey, wait a second, I was told that I'd be able to, you know, get as much for half of what I was paying for the two organizations before. And she had finally gotten so frustrated with it at a meeting I was at, she put this quote up on the board at the beginning of the meeting for everybody to see. And ultimately, you know, I think it's great. You don't marry someone for operational efficiencies. Well, you shouldn't bring two community organizations together for, only for operational efficiencies. The goal should be something bigger, something more impactful, something more valuable and more relevant. So if you find yourself facing those opinions in your community, don't be afraid to use this one. So if merging is not the right thing to do, or it's decided that we don't really need to merge, but there are some things that we can do to make our respective organizations better, there's a number of choices that you may want to propose to fight the merger discussion in your community. One is, and I'm sure most of you do this to some degree, but the more effective you can be at cooperating and working with and communicating with your peers at other organizations, the less likely you're going to get those overlap and redundancy and duplication claims, the less likely people are going to look at you all as a way to save money by making you come together. So, you know, informal but frequent cooperation and just that spirit of cooperation, so that when the situation or the need arises, you can cooperate and work together with your peers in the community for the greater good, but still keep your separate organizations. The joint venture model, I'm a big fan of this. We, as most of us, well, you may not know, but one of the things our model is to raise money for these, you know, multi-year plans that are multifaceted and touch everything around community and economic development. And they're big, broad strategies, oftentimes created by an outside consultant. And they address a lot of community and economic development issues. Very rarely can they be executed by only one organization if there are multiple organizations in the space. So the joint venture model is great, and I'm going to brag on one of our longtime clients here, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The Forward Sioux Falls model is something that I recommend everybody go look at. You can look at it at forwardsiouxfalls.com. And they've kept their chamber and their economic development foundation separate. But every 5 years, they come together around the current 5-year plan that we go out and raise money for. And that plan, as I mentioned, gets executed by both the chamber and the economic development organization. Their two respective executive committees form the joint venture management committee of Forward Sioux Falls. They collectively set the agenda for the next 5 years, and they collectively make sure that the chamber and the EDO deliver on their part of the plan. And that plan, you know, every 5 years changes. So 1 year the chamber may get the bulk of the funding because it's chamber stuff, you know, affordable housing and leadership and workforce development, things like that. The next 5 years, the Economic Development Foundation may get the bulk of the funding, like they did the last campaign we did there, because they were out of space in their industrial park and they needed, they were buying a mega site. So a bunch of the money we raised went to leveraging state monies and others to acquire a mega site. That's just what the program called for at that moment in time. But these organizations stay separate with their own boards and their own staff and everything else. Kind of a partial version of that is ad hoc initiatives, where there may be a new plan or a new project or maybe an opportunity. You know, you've got a chance to bring something to town. You know, I live in Atlanta. This kind of happened here when we brought the Olympics here years and years ago. Was if there's a special need or a special opportunity, you create this one-off where all of the organizations come together around the common good. There may be fundraising done for it. And again, the fundraising gets divvied out and allocated to multiple organizations. It's not uncommon for us in a workforce development focused initiative to raise money that gets, you know, allocated to the chamber, the EDC, and the community college, all of whom have a role to play in this workforce development initiative. So, you know, you kind of come together as needed and then go your separate ways. I mentioned before spinoffs, you know, you could go the other way. And the best example, and some of you probably have some of these where, again, as a good chamber of commerce, you've created something out of a need. And, you know, maybe it's the YP organization, you know, maybe it's an entrepreneurship effort, maybe it's a affordable housing effort that have gathered enough critical mass and they need to go out on their own, partly because you can't manage them anymore, and partly because their funding sources are different. You know, a lot of these spinoffs end up being traditional nonprofits, and they can go stand alone as a 501c3 and get grants and other, you know, sponsorship monies that maybe don't fit perfectly with your revenue model. The most recent example of this was with our longtime client in Mobile, Alabama, excuse me, as part of their entrepreneurship efforts. they acquired an old building downtown and got some grant money and bought this building, and we're going to create an incubator. Well, they figured out pretty quickly that the chamber didn't need to be in the business of running the incubator, that was best done with separate people, separate staff, separate board, and separate funding. So they spun it off, and it's doing great. But you know, the chamber still takes credit, and they kind of birthed it. And then the last option is start fresh. You know, for whatever reason, one or more of your organizations may just be unredeemable, or it just can't quite figure out what it is or who it is. The supposed function that it's there to deliver is still needed, and everybody in the community stakeholders still want that function, but the existing organization, for whatever reason, isn't delivering it. It may be best to just sort of blow it up and start over, rather than try to merge it into another organization or salvage it. We've done this in a couple of cases, and this is usually the economic development folks. They've sort of lost their way, or they've become beholden to a funder, or the public sector and the private business community don't see eye to eye on what that economic development organization should be about. So some of those things may end up just, you know, cooler heads prevail and say, you know what, let's start over. So what does all this mean? Well, and I'm gonna wrap up here and take questions if there are any. If after everything that's happened here, it's gonna happen, and you're in charge, or you've got to help, you know, shepherd the process, a couple things you need to know. Number one, as I mentioned, do it for the right reasons. Don't fight it for the wrong reasons, meaning yours or somebody else's jobs. Go into it with your eyes wide open with regard to timelines and budgets. It will take some time, and it will cost some money. And I'm not even talking about the new budget for the new organization, merged organization. Just the process of merging itself. You need to set a budget, and everybody that's told you we're going to do this merger, they need to agree to these timelines and budgets. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view of the world, a lot of that budget is going to get spent on number 3, legal help and accountants. Lawyers are going to have to be involved with, you know, uncoupling bylaws and real estate, and all of these things. And, you know, like I mentioned before, with how do we build firewalls with public money versus private money, and sunshine laws when there's an economic development project and there's public money going toward, you know, that organization, and it's now your organization. Well, if there's public money, the newspaper reporter gets to walk into any meeting they want. At least that's the case in some states. How do you deal with some of that stuff? So all these things you need to be aware of and anticipate in advance. I mentioned accounting flexibility. The example in our white paper of Topeka, Kansas talks pretty extensively about how they had to create all these firewalls, and how certain people leave the room when the chamber pack starts getting discussed, and all kinds of machinations because of, you know, accounting and fiscal accountability issues like that. I have a client in Joplin, Missouri that is, you know, the chamber is the umbrella organization for about 4 organizations. Well, that poor chamber accountant, the CFO there, she has to manage like 5 different sets of books and keep them all separate, but she's still only the chamber CFO. No sacred cows. This should go without saying, but, you know, if people are saying we're not going to merge because this is the way we've always done it, it's probably time for them to sort of get shoved out of the way and let some people that are looking forward instead of backward be in charge. If you are going to do this, get creative when it comes to your org chart. You're probably going to have a lot of committee structures that you're going to want to set up, a lot of dotted lines that sort of connect what previously were 2 separate organizations and are now one. I've seen a lot of examples of this. If anybody, you know, wants specifics, contact me here afterwards, because, you know, I've seen a lot of creative ways to where they keep the primary functions and missions of organizations intact, but bring them under one shared umbrella and funding structure and board, yet they all remain some degree of autonomy in what they do. And then the last thing, this is my shameless plug for us, you know, if you're doing this, you're probably, we're told to do it for funding purposes. Well, you know, play it back at them. If we're going to do it for funding purposes, well, then by God, we're going to do it. We're going to do it right and get aggressive. You know, if organizations are coming together because the stakeholders want more value and impact and outcomes, well, that takes money. Sometimes during that merger is the best time to be very aggressive in your funding requests and outlook and, you know, setting of budget. So don't be afraid to ask. So with that, the last thing I'll say is nothing's permanent. You know, we've been around long enough where we've helped organizations come together, and 15 years later, the winds were blowing and the community situation was different. It was time to decouple them back and have them go back and be separate organizations. So it's all fluid. With that, I will, I can't see the Q&A, Shelley, or maybe I can, if questions have come in.
Yes, you can, if you have questions. Tom, thank you very much. Please, attendees, if you have questions, you can post in the chat box now. And I echo Tom with 2020 as the year that if you are in the process of collaborating or working closer with another organization, 2020 has proved to be the year for us all to work smarter, not harder. I would recommend that you do reach out to someone with the expertise. Tom is a great contact. His contact information is on the screen now. Externally, outside of the organizations in your region that you're looking at working with, just for some consulting help. Amy from the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce Executives is recording our session today, and we'll get a copy of Tom's handouts to send out to Ed to everyone. Does anyone have any questions before we wrap up today? It's a heavy topic, and as Tom said, it does take a lot of work. One of my favorite quotes is, as right now, we all feel like we're knee deep in the day-to-day tasks. So Tom, you're getting a lot of thank yous up on the chat box. Very thorough discussion, thank you. Tom's email and phone number are on the screen. Our next MIKI Monday is set for September the 28th. And we will be talking money again because it seems to be the big question for all of us this year. But Jason Eby with YGM will be leading us through 60 sponsorship topics or our ideas in 60 minutes. It's a popular conference session, so we're going to be doing that virtually on September the 28th.
Yeah, I know Jason. He's great.
Jason is fun. We've worked with him. So I do recommend in the chat box early on Tom's presentation, I posted the link to the National Community Development Services website. So much great information can be found on their website. So if you've not visited their site or familiarized yourself with the organization, I do recommend that you do that. And with that, excellent information today, Tom. You're getting all kinds of accolade comments, but no questions. So with that, we can wrap up for today.
Okay,
and,
well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah, if questions come up later, hit me up with an email. I'm not going anywhere.
we will do that. Thank you.
Okay, take care.